Good. Our speaker today is James Lindsay, and I found out that his friends do call him Jim, so we'll go by Jim, okay? And he's has a Ph.D. in math, but he started out in science, in actually physics. So he has a background in physics and math, and he's a free thinker, a skeptic, and an author. He has a keen interest in religion, and some of the books that he has published, everyone is wrong about God. Life is in light of death, ... Infinity plus God equals folly. God doesn't, we do. Only humans can solve human challenges. The problem with God, classical theism under the spotlight, and articles in Science and Science magazine, and also Time and Philosopher's magazine. His latest article is the one he will spend some time on a little later, is the conceptual penis as a social construct. Okay? It's gotten a lot of attention, and it was written as a hoax, and it's all about nonsense, actually. Okay, so I'm sure he'll get into that in some detail, because it's been read and looked at internationally and nationally quite a bit. So he's a busy guy answering why he'd put something like this out. And he did it as a hoax and never thought it would be published. Will give us his controversial take also on social justice. And I suspect no one will go to sleep during this time, okay? Let's give a big welcome to Jim Lindsay.
All right, did I do it right? Can everybody hear me? All right, you can't hear me. You're in front. I'm between. So I've got too many microphones. Our audio-visual guy will save the day, I hope. There we go. All right, can everybody hear me now, clearly? All right, well, thank you guys for having me out to Arizona. This is my first trip to Arizona, and I think since you're a free thought group, I'll let you know it's always helpful to have an outsider's perspective on your thoughts, your beliefs. And let me tell you what I found out about Arizona. It's hot. Did you know that? It's really hot here. I leave tomorrow before it gets hot, so I don't have to. Although I'm a little bit sad that happens. But no, it's really warm. So where Jerry said that perhaps nobody will fall asleep, I might, because sleeping in the heat is a little bit different. I am from the southeast, so I'm used to heat and humidity, but it's hot in Arizona. It's really hot. So anyway, thank you for letting me experience this for the first time. I'm looking forward to experiencing cactuses and other things soon. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about this paper that got you giggling a little bit. I wrote a paper called The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct. So I will be talking to you about penises a little bit today. Conceptual ones anyway. And the ultimate commentary that I want to make is about social justice. So I saw it was good that I saw the presentation Diane did, because I see that the group is committed to the idea of social justice. When Lisa originally reached out to me about talking, she wanted me to talk about social justice instead of my book about death or my book about God, because it's kind of a big topic right now. It's kind of hot right now. And so it's also very controversial. And so what I want to talk most about is methods toward achieving social justice. I've told Lisa, and she thought it was really clever, that I believe in social justice with a lowercase s and j. So I have a problem with capital S and J social justice activism, and that's what our hoax paper was targeting. So I want to start today by reading, I know it's not the best form, but I want to read to you 4 abstracts from papers that may or may not have been published in gender studies, which is an academic discipline devoted to the feminist aspect of social justice. So your job is to try to determine which ones of these are made up and which ones are real. So I have 4 of them. We'll go one by one. I'll let you pause and reflect after each, and then we'll vote at the end and see if you think that they're made up or real. So number 1, feminist critics have often remarked on the striptease of appearance and disappearance by which the phallus both determines dominant cultural assumptions about sexuality and corporeality, while simultaneously effacing the specificity of the penis. Through an examination of contemporary representations of the penis in the popular media, such as media coverage of the Bobbitt trial, the puppetry of the penis stage show, the freak show performer Mr. Lifto, and the work of Cynthia Plastercaster, this article elucidates the mechanisms of effacement by which the specificity of the physical penis is obscured by a phallic ideal. In bringing the relationship between phallus and penis into focus, this article aims to challenge a number of important critical assumptions about the structure and operation of phallocentrism. Contrary to the widespread assumption that the phallic male body represents a rigidly stable and self-contained corporeality, in this paper I will argue that it is precisely the phallic penis which opens the male body to the possibility of transformation and otherness. So that's one abstract, that's number 1. Consider whether you think that is something that I made up or whether it's real. And we'll come back to that. Number 2. This article presents an autoethnographic account of a feminist who created an art project about her connection to men and as a result engaged in a search for Wonder Woman, whom she views as a role model who encourages both masculinity and femininity in women. As a result of this search for Wonder Woman, a small social movement began as friends, family members, and social work students became aware of the role of patriarchy in shaping young women and became determined also to find Wonder Woman. Engaging in a narrative account, self-reflection, and a critique of culture, this feminist autoethnography also attempts to resist patriarchal standards that enforce male-dominant expectations of writing and research. Implications for social work, education, and practice are discussed. So that's number 2, searching for Wonder Woman. Number 3, this article explores the formation of a tranimal hippopotamus alter ego. Confronting transgender with trans species, the author claims that his hippopotamus identity allowed him to verbally escape all at once several sets of categorization that govern human bodies, such as gender, sexuality, and age. He starts with an account of how his metaphorical hippo self is collectively produced and performed, distinguishing the subjective, the intersubjective, and the social. The article then investigates the politics of equating transgender and trans species, critically examining the question of the inclusion of xenogenders in the trans political movement. Finally, the author returns to the magical power of metaphors, arguing that metaphors do materialize insofar as the flesh does not remain unchanged by them. Analogizing his hippo self to a cut, as theorized by Eva Hayward, a regeneration of the boundaries of the self, he offers a final crossing to the world of fiction by showing how the His Dark Materials trilogy outlines an aesthetic of porosity, which suggests that the self is, as much as a novel, a work of fiction. That's number 3, the trans hippo. And number 4, this article looks into the art of male sexuality. Its starting point is the traditional biological focus on male sexuality, which has narrowed the understanding of male sexuality. Through readings of authors such as D.H. Lawrence, Catherine Millett, Susan Bordeaux, and others, the author seeks to lay out a cultural understanding of sexuality on the basis of positions of masculinity within culture. He also discusses possibilities of a male sexual ethics based on the penis as a bridge from me to you. So there's 4 abstracts from gender studies, some of which are invented. And your job is now to take guesses as to which ones are real. So if you want to raise your hand for, well, I'll just have you raise your hand if you think that they are fake. If you think any of these, some of them are fake, some of them are real, is the proposition, and your job is to guess which. Do you think it is the puppetry of the penis stage show? Is that fake? Anybody? That's number one. Yeah, everybody, it's a lot of hands in the air. Not everybody, okay. Now how about the search for Wonder Woman? Real or fake? If you think that one's fake, raise your hand. Okay, not as many, few hands, maybes. The trans hippopotamus paper, fake or real? Okay, about half and half, not as sure. And the penis as a bridge from me to you. I can't believe I'm saying that on a stage. All right, so a lot of fake hands for that. Okay, here's the joke. They're all real. Those are all real papers in gender studies. The penis as a puppet show, number one, is from a paper called The Spectacularized Penis, Contemporary Representations of the Male Phallic Body by Elizabeth Stevens, published in 2007 in the gender studies journal Men and Masculinities. The Search for Wonder Woman, which, by the way, is a fascinating account. And autoethnography, by the way, is a scholarly diary entry, if you don't know what it is. You take a personal experience, extract social truth from it, write it up in jargonish language, and then publish it as if it's true and science. And so this actually is a case where a young woman went with her boyfriend, that's her relationships with men, and sought out an action figure doll at a toy store of Wonder Woman and couldn't find it. And then wrote a scientific paper about how society is sexist because she couldn't find a Wonder Woman doll. That's from a paper called The Search for Wonder Woman, an autoethnography of feminist identity by Paige Averitt, published in Affiliate in 2009. The Trans Hippo paper is a real paper that was published this year in the Journal of the Theoretical Humanities by a scholar, I suppose, named Florentine Felix Morin, who allegedly was actually hosted at some point in the past year at this very university as a visiting scholar of some sort. The title of his paper was Ego Hippo, the Subject as Metaphor. And the fourth, the penis as a bridge from me to you. I mean, let me just say that one more time while I have the chance. The penis as a bridge from me to you is really a paper titled Masculinities and the Phenomenology of Men's Orgasms by Jürgen Lorentzen in Men and Masculinities another time. This one in 2007. This is all research-level studies being done in gender studies departments, which are sanctioned by most universities at this point. So, given these kinds of papers exist, and a little bit more motivation, my friend and colleague Peter Boghossian, the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists, and I thought it might be time to hoax gender studies, to see if we could write a ridiculous paper filled with this kind of scholarship, mimicking the language, the effusive language that they use, the themes that they draw upon, and the moral biases that they present, and see if we could get it published in a gender studies journal. And we titled our paper, The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct, where we thought one day that it would be just absolutely hilarious to write a paper where we argue that the penis doesn't really exist, but it causes all of our problems. That's really how it got started. Thought that would be funny. Not exactly a sophisticated take, I guess, but it's also, by the way, dry in Arizona. I come from the land of a lot of humidity. We can drink out of the air in Tennessee. I don't know about this, so pardon me about that. Now let me read our abstract, and you tell me, I'll let you guys decide. Does it fit in with real gender studies? Now that you've heard 4 of them, does it fit in with what you just heard? So, hegemonic masculine sexual subjectivity is constituted via the inside/outside dichotomy in ways that perpetuate the distancing of men from the sexual actions of their bodies. This occurs through the metaphorical exteriorization of male sexual corporeality. The penis comes to represent the man, to stand in and for and up for him as a separate entity, a so-called self with its own will outside the man's conscious control. This conceptual penis, culturally invested with a primal carnal intelligence, operates in contrast to and thereby resists the man's rational cerebral thought. This paper presents a discursive analysis of the production of male heterosexual subjectivity as exteriorized using extracts from popular media material and transcripts from interviews with men and women on notions of heterosexual health, safer sex practices, and male sexuality. It examines how men may employ the concept of the irrational conceptual penis as an alibi or excuse for the enactment of coercive and riskier heterosexual behaviors. So does it fit in? Yes? Does anybody think no? Does anybody think it didn't fit? Okay, it's a question. We'll get to that. Yes?
Is this about social justice?
This will get to be about social justice, yes. So that's the end, yeah. We'll get there. Yeah, we got to talk about penises before we can get to justice. That's the natural, just kidding. What's that? Well, this was yes, this was a published paper after peer review, our paper. Okay, so our abstract then, it fits in. Nobody thinks it does. Well, that's good, actually. I was hoping somebody would think this abstract didn't fit, because that wasn't our abstract, it turns out. That's from The Man with Two Brains, Hegemonic Masculine Subjectivity and the Discursive Construction of the Unreasonable Penis Self, in the Journal of Gender Studies, Volume 10, Issue 2, 2001, by Annie Potts. I just subbed out penis self for conceptual penis. So the fact is that it's very believable that a real gender studies paper, if I just sub out 2 words, looks very much like what we wrote. Our real abstract does, I think, fit in, and you can be the judge. Anatomical penises may exist, but as preoperative transgendered women also have anatomical penises, the penis vis-a-vis maleness is an incoherent construct. We argue that the conceptual penis is better understood not as an anatomical organ, but as a social construct isomorphic to performative toxic masculinity. Through detailed post-structuralist discursive criticism and the example of climate change, this paper will challenge the prevailing and damaging social trope that penises are best understood as the male sexual organ and reassign it a more fitting role as a type of masculine performance. I humbly submit that that's isomorphic, to use the word, to the previous abstract that I read, except shorter. It says the same thing, that men have an idea of their penis, and that is how we should really think of the penis, because it obscures the penis, as Annie Potts wrote, and that causes lots of problems in society. So that was the actual, no more tricks, no more jokes. That was the actual, well, there might be more jokes, but that was the actual abstract we submitted. And yes, this paper was accepted by a small social sciences journal after peer review with 2 expert readers. Cogent Social Sciences, a very small open access journal, accepted our paper after a peer review process. And as to the did they read it or not, actually I can speak to that. They did. They did read it, because we messed up when we were writing this. And in our abstract we said, through detailed post-structuralist discursive criticism, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out I don't know what that is. So I thought that I had written it into the hoax, and Peter agreed. We thought we had written it into the hoax, but we didn't. We didn't know what it was. We didn't use this tool of analysis. And one of our 2 peer reviewers identified that fact. They said, in your abstract, you mentioned that you use post-structuralist discursive analysis, and yet it appears nowhere in the paper. Correct that or take it out of the abstract. Which means not only did the person read the paper, the person knew what, and it turns out by the process of elimination, I can say she, knew what she was looking for, knew it wasn't there, and had read the paper carefully enough to determine that it wasn't there. So this paper was read by somebody with expertise in the field, and for whatever problems that may exist at this small open access journal to let them publish marginal papers, because I'm not going to deny our paper's marginal, Actually, some of our critics have described us as having been gleefully ignorant of the field, and I will own every bit of that. I am very gleefully ignorant of the field. Although I have offered, and if anybody wants to fund it or chip in on funding it at some point, I will get a advanced degree, master's or Ph.D. in gender studies as long as somebody pays me to do it. I'll become an expert in the field. We'll see how it goes. I couldn't possibly do better if I became an expert at criticizing. But anyway, we wrote this hoax. We wrote 3,000 some odd more words in what is basically a ridiculous pastiche of the Foucault and Judith Butler school of thought. As it turns out, we didn't know that either. I just quoted both of them by taking quotes that Wikipedia quoted from them. And so that it turns out to be the flavor we used. And we aimed to imitate their moral architecture, which is basically that something to do with masculinity causes all the problems in the world. And we tried to dress it up in a lot of obscurantist language, like discursive analysis and all of these other things. But we threw in red flag obscurantist language, like saying that a part of our problem is that we live in a pre-post patriarchal society. We flattered moral biases by saying that manspreading, I don't know if you all know what manspreading is, but manspreading is when men sit with their legs too wide. I said that this often occurs on public transportation such as planes, trains, and automobiles, for those of you who have seen the movie. And we said that this is tantamount to raping the space around you. Moreover, we said that climate change is raping the virgin environment, and that it's equivalent to manspreading, patriarchal society manspreading into the environment. So this, I mean, we really kind of went over the top to try to make the paper pretty ridiculous. But we also didn't stop there. We only cited 16 sources, which is pretty bad for a research article. And 5 of them are made up. They're not just made up, though. They're pulled off of a website that's called the Postmodern Generator, which uses an algorithm to generate fake postmodern papers. And the algorithm was written mimicking what Alan Sokal did in 1996 when he hoaxed a postmodern social commentary journal called Social Text. So we used a source that isn't real, it's provable nonsense that was made up as a demonstration of how easy it is to hoax this kind of obscure language and moral flattery, and we cited it several times. The only things we did to those false citations, which we drew from the papers on the Postmodern Generator, was to make them more obvious, saying that they came from sources like discussions from elsewhere or something like that, and changing one of the fake researchers' names to SQ Scammeron, who we then, because scam, S-C-A-M at the beginning, who we then cited several times through the paper, putting his name in the body of the text several times. So 5 of our 16 sources originally were bogus. It turned out to be 20 total sources, 5 of which were bogus in the end because one of our peer reviewers requested more examples to make our paper more robust. So the question is, I've read a bunch of abstracts and I've made you laugh, but wouldn't this be possible with any field? My background's in mathematics. Could I probably write a bogus mathematical abstract, come up here and read a bunch of math abstracts to you, blind you with language, and then throw mine in there and everybody's going to have a good chuckle, ha ha ha, okay, it's easy to write in the style of a technical language and blow it right over people's heads, and just not knowing what the words mean means you can get anything to pass. I contend, what's that? Oh, sorry. I contend that the answer is no. If I had written math, and I, by the way, as a mathematician, don't know how to hoax a math journal. I have no idea how to do it. But had I written a fake math paper or a fake biology paper, there are 2 primary issues in play that mean I would not be able to blow this over y'all's heads and trick you. And one is that nobody thinks those fields might be producing baloney. Nobody suspects that biology is producing baloney except a handful of creationists who have no truck in the university. Nobody believes that mathematics is producing baloney. Secondly, If we were to just sit down and waste the whole hour parsing out what all of those mathematical or biological terms mean, what you would be left with is probably really boring. It might be interesting in that it's a fact about math if you're interested in math, or a fact about biology if you're interested in biology, but it's going to be pretty cut and dry. If we decode a penis as a bridge from me to you, or a trans-hippo identity, what we are left with is not something particularly easy to take seriously as scholarship, as somebody called out. Are these papers peer-reviewed from a real academic department? So that's the issue. Is there is going to be baloney out there, of course, and people are going to produce crank things, and creationists would certainly laugh at a fake biology paper. But they don't have truck in our universities, and we don't let them have truck in our universities. Whereas gender studies has departments nearly universally. We do let them have truck in our universities. We do let them use these papers to credential themselves academically, to get seats in university committees, and to start doing their ultimate goal. When I'm not attributing this goal to them like by my imagination. Their goal has been explicit since women's studies, later gender studies, later critical theory studies departments were originated in the 1960s through, especially in the 1990s, they had a huge explosion and period of flourishing. Their goal has explicitly been to remake the university and their political image from the beginning. Pause for a minute. This is a free thought group. If we had a group of evangelical religious people of any religion saying that they are going to make academic departments with the explicit goal of remaking the university, how many of us would be comfortable with letting them into the secular university to do their in-house scholarship that's credentialed by the university, and then to use that scholarship to take over university committees and start influencing university politics and start changing the very structure of the university?
I wonder if you'd say the same thing about black studies.
Well, to a degree I will, actually. To a degree I will. But I want to make that degree really clear. I want to talk about all of the critical theories, all of the critical theory-based studies, and this is how it'll tie back to social justice. But first, then I can elaborate in that vein here. Why did we want to do a hoax on gender studies? So let me tell you what didn't motivate us first of all, because a couple of magazines, Salon magazine, Slate magazine, even the Washington Post, suggested that perhaps we are sexist, and that's why we wanted to take on women or women's studies. Well, that's not true. Normally, it would be laughable to the point where I shouldn't even be bringing it up. We should just ignore that kind of thing. But it's very fashionable right now to traffic in such accusations, as proved by the fact that these publications do publish defamatory statements of that kind. But I have two daughters, and I understand I can't, it's like saying, oh, I have a black friend. I can't just say, oh, I have daughters, so I'm not a sexist. But I do know what I want from my daughters. And I want my daughters to live in a world of opportunity and freedom, and I want them to not experience sexism or discrimination. I want them to feel confident. I don't want them to be seduced by victim narratives that tell them that there are these strong forces working against them that lead them to externalize blame. I don't want to see my daughters sell themselves short. I want them to realize that they have every bit as much potential as every human being to do as much as they want in whatever fields they choose to pursue. Sexism is not our motivation here. In fact, combating sexism is far closer to our motivation. Because when you have this kind of poor scholarship representing your social justice movement and providing its intellectual artillery, you will inspire backlash. You will inspire people to not be able to take you seriously. You will diminish the real strides, the real scholarship, the real efforts being made by gender scholars, sociologists, biologists, psychologists. All of that gets put away when we're having to see papers get published about things like the penis as a bridge from me to you. Or the case that actually motivated us was the feminist glacier study, which said that we need to redo glaciology because we need feminist glaciology that takes into account things like the genders of ice, so that we can improve human and ice relations. And the scholars that presented this paper that many still hold out as a hoax, but they say it's not, had a presentation. They did a TED Talk, and the woman stood on stage and did provide a victim narrative for why her stuff must be true, that she was subjected to harassment, and went on to argue things like, well, this ice, according to natives, and we should take them very seriously, is male ice because it's dirty and it's water stingy and all these other things. And the crowd laughs. Oh yeah, male ice, dirty, nasty, gross, aha. And then the female ice is this beautiful blue and white, and it gives off lots of pure water, and it's clean. And so they categorize male and female ice. And rather than wanting to challenge that notion and say, maybe we just call it ice, and maybe we just talk about it being different levels of contaminated, or maybe we talk about, she wants to embrace the idea that we look at it through these lenses of masculine and feminine, and that we look at it through these lenses not merely to obtain more nuanced information, as is the claim, but also, as she goes on to claim, in order to be able to remake the science itself in a way that looks through the feminist lens. Again, I beseech you to think about it. What if we were saying we're going to look at science just through a Christian lens? Well, obviously, things like evolution, cosmology are going to start having serious amounts of change done to how they're allowed to proceed. Truth doesn't follow from investigation anymore. The ministry of truth decides what is true first, and then investigation is done to support that. We saw this, for instance, with the sugar industry recently. Many of you maybe have seen these headlines where it's been found out that the sugar industry for 50 years published bogus research saying that fat is bad and therefore substituting in sugar. Biased research. And the consequences of biased research are bad. People get diabetes. People become obese. People lose trust in nutritional science. This week, we're not allowed to eat fat. Next week, we're not allowed to eat eggs. Now we're not allowed to eat sugar. Now we all have to be vegan. Now we're supposed to eat paleo. Nobody knows what's right. And so you end up with this murky place where pseudoscience can start to take root. These are real problems when shoddy scholarship or biased scholarship start to run the show. But more importantly, there's backlash movements against this kind of thing. Trump became president. That'll be a matter of debate for probably centuries, if we live that long, as to how that happened. Whether you support him or not, that's probably a simple fact. Historians are going to debate that for a long time. I have a number of conservative friends living in the Southeast in a rural county. I live outside of Knoxville, technically. And many of my conservative friends are very smart, and they're very happy to tell you, when you talk to the intelligent ones, why they supported Trump, if they did. And it's because they are terrified of this creeping power dynamic coming out of these critical theory activist departments taking over universities and education, departments that produce more educators than any other type of profession, who then take these modes of activism into our primary and secondary schools. And they're very concerned about that. Are they right? About the problem, maybe. About the solution, I don't think so. But nonetheless, Trump was elected. We have the very Republican Congress that's enacting very not social justice goals with glee. Ha ha, take that liberals is almost their banner phrase. Everything Obama did, we're going to undo it and break it just to break it. This seems to be the objective. In other words, social justice victories that have been incremental over time, if they inspire too much backlash, if they are done in a way that inspires people to become terrified enough to reject them, can lead to bad consequences. It can cause people not to believe gender sociology, for instance, is doing good, important work on questions about gender. It can cause people, rather than being willing to listen to legitimate scholarship regarding trans issues and trans rights, to see it as just another political battleground. And this ultimately works out to be bad for the people it's most supposed to help. So this is why we wanted to do a hoax on gender studies in particular. Bad journals, bad papers in those journals, bad scholarship. All this is bad for public reception of science. It's bad for the university. It's bad for education. It's bad for the reputations of academics more generally. Because the public, for all that it is not necessarily nuanced. And it's easy to lump together real scientists doing real important work with very rigorous and careful methods with people doing a search for Wonder Woman. It's very easy to do that if you aren't really up on what's going on. And so that's a problem. Furthermore, this backlash didn't just come because this stuff seems silly. It came because there are actually open hostilities toward certain institutions like the liberal West, capitalism, science. One of the foremost feminist scholars of the past 20 years is Sandra Harding, or maybe 30 years, Sandra Harding. She wrote a book in which she described, because science seeks to pry truth from the universe, seeks to go out and look at nature and find out and then control and take over nature. She wrote that Newton's Principia is a rape manual in a book that has been cited thousands of times by gender scholars. This is not good, and there are many, many papers that follow from Harding's work and other people's work that openly declare, and I can get sources for a dozen of these in a small amount of time, that science itself is sexist, or that it's racist, or that it's a tool of oppression. Science is none of these things. Science is a tool of rigorously trying to determine what's true from what's false without bias. It's a means of trying to exclude bias to get to the right answers. Science says that if I do an experiment, I'm a white man. If I do an experiment and I get result X, and you're a woman and you do the experiment and my work was correct, you will get result X too. And if you are black, you will get result X too. And if you are a robot with no gender, with no race, and you have the capability to do the experiment, you will get result X too, because nature doesn't care what your political biases are. Truth precedes political bias. So we really need to stand up for and defend science. I can talk more about the hoax, but I'll talk a little bit, I'm going to reorganize, I guess, on the fly and talk a little bit more about social justice, since I've kind of segued into it, about why this matters then. And it's my fundamental belief is that social justice activism is extremely important. We have a lot of important questions in society right now about race, about gender, about trans rights, about all these things, and they all hinge upon this kind of scholarship. So it needs to be the best scholarship possible. It can't be the kind that openly invites questions, not the questions of the kind that help us move toward truth, but of just absolute derisive criticism. It can't be the kind that leaves gaping holes in its rigorous methods, or its unrigorous methods, that allow people to gain not just toeholds, but entire grasps to rip boulders off of the edifice. Gender studies, race studies, the interface of these things with society today, to face the problems we're actually facing, needs sound scholarship. And if the forefront of the scholarship is coming out of obscure, postmodern, deeply biased scholarship, then we have a massive problem. And that massive problem will result in things like political backlash, the general expectation that the field doesn't deserve to exist. We have two states. My state is one of them, attempting to defund gender studies across the board. And of course, lawmakers are not necessarily going to be the easiest ones to trust, to say, yeah, we're going to get this exactly right. We're going to cut out the parts that need to be cut and keep the good stuff. They're going to say, whoa, you study gender. You're a sociologist. What, psychology? Pfft, no funding. Get rid of the cancer, cut the whole leg off. And we don't want that. These are important questions. What I think is going on with our current social justice activism, which follows from this scholarship and has since the 90s, and if you doubt that, all you have to do is look at these campus protests that keep coming up week after week or month after month, roiling to the point where violence is coming out. People got attacked when Charles Murray came to speak. The recent case at Evergreen, where students were patrolling the campus with bats, and all this other violence came up, all these other protests and silencing. I mean, I was scared, frankly, today that somebody might pull a fire alarm that I would come and talk about our hoax, because it's been pretty controversial. This kind of thing is blatantly illiberal, and if this is the language that these protesters are using is exactly what's coming out of these departments, you don't have to look too hard or guess too hard as to where they're getting these illiberal and authoritarian ideas. If we want to have a social justice that moves us forward in a liberal society, this isn't the way. What's happening is we're winning, social justice activists have been winning victories, but they're Pyrrhic victories. I don't know if you know the Pyrrhic story, but Plutarch wrote a story a long time ago about Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek guy who came in, waged war on the Romans, won a decisive battle barely, lost all of his commanders, lost most of his troops, lost everything. And so the Romans just replenished their army and came out and stomped him. And Plutarch recorded that he had said something along the lines of, if I fight one more battle like this, or one more win like this, then I'm finished. A Pyrrhic victory means that you win the battle, but set yourself up to lose the war. And the social justice activist tactics of using a kind of very browbeating method that doesn't allow criticism, there's clear and demonstrated evidence, not by me, I just wrote a hoax, but clear and demonstrated evidence by a woman, Charlotta Stern, Steven Pinker, and so on, that there's ideological blinkering in these fields. People challenge them with science. People challenge them with philosophy. People criticize their work, and then they ignore that criticism despite its validity and proceed as though it doesn't exist. This is a problem. And what happens is we win. If we care about social justice, I say that's who the we is in this sentence. We win small victories and piss people off so bad in the process that they're willing to burn down the whole house in order to get rid of what they're seeing as a problem. And it's easy to pin this, as the scholarship, if we will call it that, does, on it just being entrenched racism or sexism. But you only have to spend time listening with an open mind to people to realize that there are deeper issues at play. There are people who fear for the future of liberal democracy, of the Western ideal, not necessarily problems with race or sex or gender driving them, although there certainly are some. I mean, I live in the South, I hear it all the time. I won't deny it. I'm not going to say it's not a problem. I'm saying that the solution to the problem requires the best information that we can have, which requires not biased scholarship. In particular, we need scholarship from this aspect of the academy that's clear. Moral bias has to be taken out, so does clarity has to be injected. I read these abstracts to you. They are not clear. They obscure what they're really talking about. They possibly intentionally, although I don't think the scholars themselves are doing it, just like many religious people are very sincere in their beliefs, but they're still obscuring the ways in which they're protecting their religious and moral biases. I think the scholars are likely the same. They've learned to speak a language that obscures the actual intentions of their words, that redefines words to mean something other than their colloquial meaning, their meanings that they think are useful to spread into the public. Here's some good words for you. Equity. Everybody wants equity. Sounds fair. But as the poster and the announcements beforehand showed, that with the Orin the boy was holding or wearing, we don't want equity, we want equality. And they're not the same, but they sound similar. And so if you go look up equity in the precise definition that's used by these departments, it means something very different from what you think it means when you think of it as equality. It means that the outcomes are designed to be demographically as representative of whatever set of demographics statistics they think fit the circumstances. So we should have exactly 50% men and 50% women, or 51% women as it may be, in any given body, regardless of if there are that many women who are interested, to say nothing of qualified. We should have exactly this percent white, this percent black, this percent Latino. And this is exactly the wrong direction to go if we're interested in having equality, which is a fairness of opportunity for everybody. Another good example is inclusive. We want an inclusive environment, right? It sounds good. Does anybody want an environment that's not inclusive? Sounds great. I'm behind it. So is the university. But what does inclusive mean? Inclusive in this lexicon, and these are the people who will take up the committees that enforce it, means that it's scrubbed of language that can be found offensive to anybody unless that person happens to be of a dominant or oppressor class. Is that what we want? Do we want to have speech police installed in our universities? When they say we want an inclusive environment, it sounds great, but what they want is something very different. So this misuse of language is very important also. And even if the people fighting against this and backlashing against this are jerking their knee to the ceiling and completely missing the point, even if that's the case, they're tapping into the fact that some kind of sleight of hand, academic sleight of hand, or misfeasance is taking place, and they don't want it. And really none of us should. We really should want to have our social justice activism promote results in social justice. It should succeed in moving society forward, to making things more equal, to making things more fair, to taking away discrimination, to addressing the legitimate problems of privilege, to answering the hard questions that lie at the center of questions like trans issues, gender and society, how race and gender impact disease rates, how entrenched or systemic biases, that's another one, systemic racism or systemic sexism. There's a perfectly good term for that, which I just used. But if you drop that prefix, that modifier, systemic, and just call it racism and say racism is privilege plus power, now you've got a different animal. And you creep it right in under the radar. If we want to get to a society that features less of these things, we have to be honest about our scholarship. We have to be honest about our problems. We can't let our biases direct us. We should not, as hoaxers, and this is I'll wrap up, we should not have, as hoaxers, we should not have been able to identify a clear moral bias in the field and mimic it. Just like I wouldn't know how to start with biology or math or chemistry or political science, for a matter of fact. Political science is pretty soft. I've got a paper published now in philosophy, so that's fairly humanity-based, technical language. I don't know how to hoax it. There's not a clear political bias. There are occasionally clear fashionability biases, but there's not a clear moral bias that points in one direction. There's not a clear ideological blinkering that resists saying criticism against that scholarship. There's not a clear cut, like if I would have written, for example, as Alan Sokol wrote about us, if I would have written the conceptual vagina or conceptual vulva and talked about toxic femininity, and I heard people joking about it, and so I'll probably, when this goes online, become public enemy number one for saying this, which says everything I really need to say about it. But I heard people joking about the relationship of a husband and a wife, and the fact that the husband is happily married because he does what his wife says. And so there's an old saying, happy wife, happy life. And if I had written a paper about toxic femininity based on that aphorism and talked about how toxic femininity rules over this aspect of the world at the home, or it rules over the workplace because of sexual harassment laws and all this, of course it's ridiculous. I'm not talking about something I seriously believe. If I'd written that, can anybody in this room believe that I could get that published in a gender study journal? So what we are aiming for with this is an avenue toward getting more legitimacy in scholarship. So I didn't talk too much about the issue with our journal. We ended up publishing in a small, pay-to-publish, open access journal that there's a lot could be said about that. It did involve peer review, but there's a problem with journals that are open access having quality control issues. That needs to be corrected so that the public can trust scholarship more. Simultaneously, as not demonstrated by us or our hoax, but by scholars like Steven Pinker and Charlotta Stern have demonstrated, there are ideological biases. There are problems with obscurantist language that present in all critical theory departments, whether they focus on gender, as we hoaxed, race, or anything else involving this postmodern critical theory, there are severe problems there of ideological bias preceding, not following, scholarship. And we think that that needs to be cleaned up as well. And so what we're hoping for is that social justice activism going forward will be able to achieve more results, we'll be able to get more people on board, because social justice is in the interest of everybody. Conservatives should largely, except for the lunatic fringe, and I know they have hegemonic power in the conservative side of the aisle right now, to use the terms. I know that there's that issue, but conservatives otherwise should be behind social justice just as much as everybody else is. This shouldn't be a deeply, deeply partisan issue where social justice is used as a term of being the enemy to conservatism. Everybody should be interested in a more equitable society or fair society, and I think people are. Talking with Southerners on a daily basis who have their set of issues and deep, deep, deep conservative beliefs, I'm convinced that they are as eager as anybody to move past racism, move past sexism, and so on the larger part. Of course, there's the fringe, which may represent half of them for all I know. But we should want to diminish the size of that fringe and invite more people into this new, more moderate, more defending the secular West center and form coalitions and allyships with them, rather than giving them reasons to freak out and run further right and agree with the lunatics on their side. So we hope for that. That's actually why we hoaxed gender studies, and we did so in a pay-to-publish journal, is to bring attention to these problems that are poisoning scholarship and hurting the objectives of both science and social justice. And that's all I've got to say for now.
If you have questions, please line up in the aisles and use the microphones. If you're not able to stand, raise your hand and we'll bring you a wireless mic.
The journal that accepted your paper, you said it was small and obscure and it was a pay to publish. And that didn't come out until the very end of your talk.
No, I actually ended up skipping that page, sorry.
I've been on the other side of this, and occasionally you're trying to make a deadline for like 8 papers for one issue, and yours could have been the 8th that was in line. They said, this is a bunch of hocus, but we need to publish it.
But we need 8.
So
right?
What was the rejection rate?
The journal has a 61% rejection rate. 61% rejection rate. That doesn't say anything about the quality of the papers they accept. And I don't want to stand here and defend the journal. In fact, I'm annoyed to no end that the internet has forced me to defend this journal that I've now hoaxed. I suspect they have very deep problems. They might, God, I hope my lawyer's okay with this. They might be a vanity journal, which will publish a lot of things that they shouldn't. I don't think they are. And my lawyer said I definitely can't say that they are, but the internet concluded that they are for me. So now I have to defend the fact that this clearly deeply troubled journal published a paper that they never should have published because I don't want to get wrapped up in slandering them, more or less. They do advertise a 61% rejection rate. I don't know the quality of their papers. I looked on, they have many disciplines under a parent journal. That's an umbrella term. They have 22 different disciplines with specific journals. We used Cogent Social Sciences. There's also Cogent Mathematics. I looked briefly at the Cogent Mathematics papers, and they seem to be legitimate math, but the kind nobody would ever care about. That, I don't know another way to put it. I mean, just that's what they are.
Jim, I thought you said you didn't pay.
We actually did not pay. That is a quirk of circumstance, and here's how this happened. We were contracted to pay. The journal asks for $1,350, which sounds like a lot to publish a paper, but to qualify that, we just published, Peter and I together actually, Peter Bogosian and I, just published a philosophy paper, and we had the option to publish that paper traditionally or open access. And if we publish it open access, they wanted $2,950 to publish it open access. So $1,350 is actually relatively low within open access journals. What does open access mean? It means there's no paywall. You don't have to subscribe to the journal to read the paper. Anybody can go do it. But because there's no subscription fees, the journal covers its costs in some other way, usually by having somebody pay. In this case, to strengthen the case for the journal, we did not proceed with using Cogent Social Sciences until we confirmed that the Portland State, that's where Peter's affiliated, the Portland State University Library lists Cogent Social Sciences as an acceptable, non-predatory open access journal in their library system, which means university libraries, possibly this university library, will pay to publish in that journal on behalf of the author. Many probably do if Portland State does.
When I think about or thought about social justice, which was the subject today, I first of all think about economic factors. You haven't mentioned it, only gender, and then slightly race. I think that many of these things will diminish a lot when we pay a little bit of attention to economic issues, which is, in my opinion, the first issue of social justice.
I agree with you completely. And so the fact that I didn't come up here to talk about economics. Well, no, it's not just, well, yes, that's true too. I definitely am too cerebral. That is a problem. And now that I dip into philosophy, I'm hopeless. Sorry, philosophers in the audience. No, the fact that I didn't feel like I should stand up here and mention things like economics and political entrenchment and things like that as primary issues regarding social justice, because they are. They absolutely are. These are the legitimate issues. The fact is that this rhetoric coming from these departments that's now internalized in the broader society has overcome the entire social justice argument, where people feel like it is this argument about these particular specific topics. And so it obscures, like I was saying, it obscures the legitimate scholarship, it diminishes the legitimate scholarship's importance, and it prevents us from being able to get to the bottom of our issues because we're too busy arguing about whether the movie Wonder Woman was feminist or not feminist, or should have had a black Wonder Woman or a fat Wonder Woman. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. And this is the argument.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. Did you submit your paper to any other journals?
Yes. Actually, our paper originally went to a journal called Norma, the International Journal for Masculinity Studies, which is slightly higher up the pecking chain in gender studies, and they desk rejected the paper. They did not take it. Now, this is where the story gets interesting. We did not go looking for an open access journal originally. I know what confounding variables do, and the controversy that followed was a mess. We got an email from Norma saying, we don't think this paper is a good fit for our journal, but please consider our sister journal, Cogent Social Sciences. We will internally transfer your paper there for you. And so that's when we contacted the university library system to find out if Cogent is covered or if it's predatory. We made the decision to go for it, recognizing it brings in the confounding variable of both open access, low quality journal, and maybe gender studies to some varying degrees. And so, I mean, to their credit, Norma did reject the paper, but then they transferred it to this other one, and we thought, well, that makes this story interesting in and of itself. Norma has later given a statement that they did not know they were transferring our paper, and did it by mistake, which I don't know what that says. But Norma and Cogent are both owned by the same parent publishing company, Taylor and Francis.
And then also, one of the points you're making leads to this argument that I've heard about hard and soft science. And a lot of people consider all soft sciences to be kind of a joke, especially people in the hard sciences like math and biology and chemistry. Right. They consider all soft sciences, anthropology, sociology, psychology, to be just a bunch of bunkum, along with gender studies. So, you know, I propose that 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 a lot of those different fields could be subjected to the same kind of criticism and hoax.
Well, that is possible. I agree with you, and I actually think that that's a problem. I don't agree with my hard science brethren that the soft sciences or even the humanities are worthless or are a joke or even engage in poor scholarship. I just think that they should be held to the same, not the same identical type, but the same, similar kind of rigor that other fields are. And this is actually what in part caused the problem with many soft sciences and many humanities fields, is in the 90s and a little bit before as postmodernism really flourished academically. There became this vision that if we talk in this very obscure, jargony language that's almost impenetrable to the layperson, fashionable nonsense is what Alan Sokal called it, that they look more scientific. They look like they deserve more credit. But the onus on the humanities, which isn't quite the soft sciences, the onus on the humanities is to speak extremely clearly and to be very humane and to reach to our common experience as well as to our unique experiences and voices, to appeal to humanity more broadly. That's why it's called the humanities. Obscurantist language does not help that process. In fact, it makes people say, wow, look, they feel so inferior within themselves that they can't just do what they do well. They have to try to copy jargon and scientific sounding language. And that actually contributes to the problem of people thinking they're a joke. Now, the soft sciences, psychology, sociology, and so on, present their own issues because rigor is much more difficult when the problems are much more complicated. You have to have a lot more space to suspend judgment. There's also a lot more room for fraud, as is being determined as people are starting to look at what's called the replication crisis in psychology and in sociology. Very few, something like 50% of papers that they've tested so far from many branches of psychology and sociology don't replicate. And there's all kinds of problems like p-hacking, which is a technical statistical term, and falsified data that have come out. And we, of course, overall, the goal is not for us, we don't want to destroy the study of gender. We want to help encourage a situation that increases its rigor. And so that should mean that good philosophy is making its way in and informing what these scholars are doing. Good science can't be ignored when neurobiology is able to demonstrate, or when social psychology with very high replicability is able to demonstrate certain facts about gender, for example. Those facts can't go ignored because they run counter to the narrative. And so what we hope for actually is an internal review of these fields that, just like happened with literary criticism and many other humanities so far following Alan Sokal's hoax, purges this postmodern stuff out and goes back to, even if they are humanities, even if they are trying and getting things wrong sometimes because the nature of the problem is so difficult, that we adhere to methods that accept legitimate criticism and try to work their way toward an undetermined truth that is closer to the real truth. I think generally people are well-meaning and scholars are very intelligent and people put forth good ideas, but very rarely are we as intelligent as we like to believe. We're very often wrong. I might be wrong standing in front of you today. And so the way that we find out is by asking hard questions, critical questions, examining the data, examining the flaws in the approaches, not just the successes. And we have to put forth what we can, do the best we can, and cut away the errors, and that's how human knowledge progresses. And so that's actually what I think we probably agree in large part. And my hope overall from this event is that we are initiating a conversation, and it has initiated it apparently very big in Europe, Sweden in particular, that starts to increase the scrutiny and rigor on these departments and helps produce better scholarship that gets better answers, that advances issues related to social justice and draws them back into other fields like economics, where the biggest impacts will come out.
Let me comment on what you've been saying. First of all, it took me about 15 minutes to see where you were going, because it was only when you changed one of the words that you used because I finally clued in to where you were going. Let me start by saying that, first of all, I like to think of myself as having been a scientist, although I'm not sure whether I am still. There are two things. First of all, it is true even in mathematics that there are hoaxes. I give you a reference. You can look up a fellow named Maurice Gross, who is a professor at the precedes, and he published a paper dealing as a hoax in a French publication. I no longer remember the name. The key to why I regard it as a fake publication is that the claim was made that was published from the South Hanoi Institute of Technology. That's he claimed. You switched from using the word science with regard to gender studies and ultimately got to the use of the word scholarship. Now, for those of us, again, who are scientists, there is a difference between scholarship and science. I would even claim that in certain sciences, and particularly biology, psychology, there have been, up until, let's say, roughly speaking, 70 years ago, very little science and a lot of scholarship. Your insistence on the notion of rigor is very important.
Thank you. I agree. That's, I think, there are a couple of places where I think things went wrong in these fields. And I am a big proponent, I hope I made clear, of gender science, of answering these questions as accurately as we can, realizing that these are hard questions to answer. But somewhere along the line, postmodernist philosophy wormed its way in. And I can't speak to why that happened because I don't know. But I can guess. And my guess is because it makes the claim that truth isn't really knowable at all, which is as anti-scientific a claim as you can make. But that gives scholars that embrace postmodern philosophy a distinct advantage to say that any criticism is actually coming from a place of political power and political bias or personal bias, as opposed to saying that it adheres to rigorous epistemologies or rigorous methods. And so postmodernism became the poison that made this field ultimately hoaxable in the way that we proceeded. And we ultimately did hoax postmodern gender studies, not gender studies overall. And if it were race, it's not race studies overall. It's the parts of these fields that have accepted postmodern scholarship at their core, which is not science. In fact, it's antithetical to science. Now, it goes a little further back, like I said. The ultimate history of these departments, women's studies was first, was literally to remake the university. Now, I am a very charitable person, and I do think that the original goal was good, was to increase the equality at the university, to break the old boys club, so to speak. And that's great. But somewhere along the line, it's shifted from equality to equity. And I told you in the talk about the very subtle difference in that use of language. And then in some cases, it's become outright, because of following these postmodern scholarship ideas to their logical conclusions, which are all about power dynamics, not about facts necessarily, but about power dynamics and their interplay in society. It has gone to the point now where it's clearly becoming more and more of a power struggle over who gets to speak, who gets to say, who gets to decide what the policies are, who gets to decide what behavior is and isn't acceptable. And I'm not talking about behaviors necessarily well outside of the acceptable norm within a liberal society. I'm talking about behaviors like having a speaker with a controversial point of view stand up here and present to an audience who we should presume is intelligent enough to weigh, criticize, and ignore parts of that message that don't need to be accepted. Or in other words, that the audience itself, especially in universities, is in the process of becoming critically engaged with material in order to winnow its way toward the truth. But when it becomes about who's allowed to speak, who's allowed to have a chance, that's a political objective that has, in my opinion, very little place, if any, in the university. And it's got dangerous positions are afforded in broader liberal society. The point should be that we all live on the same street together, not that one of us has conquered the street and says that everybody has to live according to our rules. And we have to find ways to work harmoniously as time goes on.
It seems to me that there's a conflating of scholarship and data, the difference between philosophy and science. What you're talking about is a system where studies, you talk about gender studies or women's studies or African studies, those are just, I don't know what. There's no data. There's only opinion.
So
where do you see the studies interfering with science?
So the first part of that is, again, to agree with you. The fields are based largely on opinion. I would classify them very vaguely within a school of philosophy, but they're bad philosophy. And there's the line that I draw, and for those of you who have ever heard me, I don't talk about it as much lately, but for some of you maybe have seen me speak or seen things that I've published before. I'm fairly critical of philosophy as a field too. I think about 95% of it's crap. Pretty critical of philosophy. And so that's a pretty broad statement. But the line between philosophy and sophistry is when philosophy starts assuming its conclusions and then chasing them in a circle. That becomes sophistry. That's where the line between, for instance, philosophy and theology is. Theology was it first. All of a sudden, better methods came into the academy, and philosophy separated from theology to now where theology is kind of in boutique departments at certain universities and not others. Same kind of thing here. If the assumption leads the scholarship, then you're engaging in sophistry more than you're leading in philosophy. Now, philosophy, in general, proceeds always via logic upon a set of assumptions. And so often philosophy looks very scholarly in the fact that it is internally logically consistent. Most scholars are able to produce sound arguments, or if they're not going to become philosophers. And those sound arguments depend utterly on the quality of the assumptions underneath them. The sciences distinguish themselves from philosophy in this way by agreeing largely on what the fundamental assumptions are. The fundamental assumptions of empiricism, for instance, of critical review and retaining in a provisional way what truths survive critical examination, trying to defeat propositions instead of confirm propositions. In fact, Peter and I have another paper we've written that discusses, a philosophy paper, that discusses the difference between confirmation-seeking philosophy and philosophy that focuses on defeasibility, or the ability to overturn an idea that's wrong. And we proclaim, I guess, that good philosophy, which includes the sciences then, proceeds upon defeasibility, not upon confirming our beliefs. And so that's, I mean, ultimately what we're really trying to get to then is how do we get data, information, impartial information that you or I or anybody, regardless of race, gender, period in history, you name it, age, status as a person in material class or social class, economic class, you take out every one of those variables. How do we get information that we can agree upon according to those standards? How do we get that information into a system that studies an important topic that is now using a tool like autoethnography, which is the height of bias, which is I experienced it, therefore it's true. That's literally the idea, which is why autoethnography is often derided as being me studies or me search instead of research. And so how do we get data to bear upon this. And people have tried. Alan Sokol hoaxed this. Gross and Levitt wrote a book in the 1990s about this called Higher Superstition. They talked about this, trying to get this stuff to get cleaned up. And here we are 20 some odd years later, and it's still an enormous problem. And this lovely scholar, Charlotta Stern, recently published a paper where what she did was she took papers that cite the most cited gender studies paper in history, which is West and Zimmerman's Doing Gender, 1987, Gender and Society. She took papers that cited that after Steven Pinker's The Blank Slate, which challenges most of these postmodern ideas about gender, came out. And then she took a random sampling of papers that cite Doing Gender and then had them graded according to a rubric for how much ideological blinking there is to avoid or ignore or to decry the science. And she found an overwhelming amount of the papers coming out of gender studies that are citing, or these other critical theory studies that are citing Doing Gender, exhibit ideological bias. This is clear. The question is, how do you get people who are willfully ignoring, by having their own academic sub-universe, willfully ignoring scholarship that's critical of them, to accept critical information so that their scholarship can improve? And all I can hope is that scrutiny does that. I don't know.
I'm just having trouble finding data points for these ideas. That's all they are, is just statements of I think there's bias.
Right.
And how can you prove it? Where's the data?
There are good gender sociologists and race sociologists who study
then you've
these.
got sociology. And then what are you doing with gender studies?
I don't
You've
know.
already got a study.
Yeah, that's
that
my point. I don't know.
Is
don't
a
know.
soft science. Admittedly, what do we need a gender studies for?
Why do we need bad philosophy on top of it? Right. I don't know. And that's what we hope gets cleared up by this.
Yeah, huh? I'm a numbers person.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm a numbers person too.
Yeah, where's the data? Show me data. If you're going to do science, even soft science, you got to have data.
Got to have data. I
And
100% agree.
Don't give me your opinion.
Thank you. I agree 100%.
Okay.
You should speak for me next time. That was good.
Yeah, I'll just kind of expand on that. I came down with a full question. In the just released Skeptical Inquirer, there's a good article by Witkowski about where they're pushing the psychology journals towards open data. A number of people, scientists, have pushed to get have done studies on how much data was available in these journals and so forth. And when they requested data, only about 25% of the people that produced articles were even willing to share their data. Yeah. And then a smaller portion of that, once it was studied, was good data. You know, the scientific studies weren't good. So what he's pushing for is that they have open data, and he's talking about psychology, but the same would be true for philosophy.
Sure.
That part of the problem when he's talking about data is the scientists and the people who write these articles won't share their data with anybody else, and therefore the field can't grow, and we can't verify what we've got.
Right, that's a crisis. It's an epistemological crisis in the field. It's also leaking into reducing academic quality. It's now being revealed that there's a massive problem with that. I'm not an expert in the replication crisis, but if somebody's hiding their data or saying that their data is, I went to Target and couldn't find a doll and that's my data, that's concerning. And that, like I said, diminishes scholarship overall. Any legitimate work where there is data, sociologists or whoever that's doing it, all of that's diminished by the fact that this other aspect of the field is both very, very obvious. They make themselves very, very obvious, I should say, on university campuses, and that they kind of, it's kind of like a story you were telling me last night, where somebody came to Victoria Falls and discovered it, despite the fact that, you know, people had lived there for millennia beforehand. And so gender studies in many cases has come into this gender sociology and planted its flag and has rediscovered the true way to study gender. But good sociology exists, and it's very hard to find. In fact, it's very difficult to get gender sociologists to speak out and say, look, there is a clear difference between legitimate gender scholarship and then this postmodern drivel. Because if you get them to speak out, they get pilloried out of their jobs. You can look at the case where it's not quite the same, but you can look at the reaction that happened to the scholar Rebecca Tuvel recently when she published in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia a paper arguing that trans race can be concluded on many of the same philosophical arguments that transgender rights are concluded. And people went berserk. They didn't just criticize the paper. They didn't just analyze the arguments and say where she went right and where she went wrong. They didn't have an academic discussion. They came out in droves signing petitions to get her fired, her own academic advisors writing articles slandering her. This is not scholarship at that point, and this is a crisis that definitely needs to be addressed. We have a group of very motivated activists posing as scholars who have planted their flag in a branch of scholarship, and they've discovered it, and now it's called Victoria Falls, not whatever it was called before.
It would be wonderful to speak long into the night with you about the pursuit of truth and postmodernism, but let me ask one very basic question. Since ridicule is one of the most commonly used informal fallacies today, and you've used plenty of it today yourself.
Sure.
How are you going to measure when you're all done whether your efforts have been successful or not, or whether they've just become fuel for ridicule by your enemies?
That's a good question. I do need to give that one more thought, so this is going to be a speculative, off-the-cuff answer. Ultimately, of course, what we would want to do, and I'm not encouraging anybody to do this, but what would really show this, of course, a single hoax is not necessarily going to demonstrate anything, but if large numbers of hoaxes could be submitted to different journals at different levels of quality, reputability versus open access, and so on, across many fields, and then collect that data, that would tell something. For us to gauge whether we're committing the fallacy of relying upon ridicule would, I think, take an internal systematic review by scholars in the field who have the credentials and have the knowledge, to have gender sociologists, to have economists that work touches on this, to have other scholars who work in these fields, psychology, sociology, neurobiology, I could probably cognitive psychology, name a few more, come out, criticize the field, and determine which parts are and which parts aren't engaging in legitimate scholarship. For instance, what Charlotta Stern did is a good first bid into that, by looking to identify if there actually is this ideological blinkering that we decided to make fun of. I think if there were internal or externally done, although it's harder, systematic reviews of the field to look for rigor in how they draw their conclusions, to look for biases in their philosophical assumptions, and then to pursue those avenues, which I would be happy to engage in if I can find the time, for sure, then we would be able to decide whether or not this was a juvenile prank or a successful expose of something that needed exposure. And I will suspend judgment. I might just be a little bit of a jerk. I'm not sure. It's possible. I didn't mean to be. I didn't set out to be, but that may be how it ends up. It depends on what the field is able to do or show. Now, on the other hand, if they decide not to engage in such a review and merely decry us or decry similar attempts or such, that's kind of a data point in its own sense, saying that why wouldn't a field of scholarship be open to critical review? Well, the only reason is because it's infected with some kind of systemic bias.
in the news lately that personal transportation company Uber, it's been found out that it was managed very poorly. It was totally out of control. Basically, uncontrolled sexual harassment. Oh, it's too loud? Okay. That's okay. So it was, and I've noticed there's been quite a bit of this going on recently. It's like there's this contradiction. You know, there's all this emphasis on the rights of people, but absolutely nothing is being done. In fact, people's rights are being, in essence, just disrespected more than ever. And it's like, the establishment, the authority, whoever, whatever, they seem to be caught in this massive contradiction. I mean, if there's so much emphasis on, this minority group, that minority group, why are these, why is everything totally out of control? It's like we can see it, and nothing's being done about it. I just want your comment on that.
Okay, yeah. I mean, my blanket statement, of course, is my goal with this is to improve the level of scholarship that diminishes discrimination, diminishes harassment, and diminishes the impacts of societal privileges that are unearned and unrecognized. So to the degree that those problems exist anywhere, I do hope that we are continually moving forward in a way that minimizes them. So I guess the best I can say about those kinds of problems. I abhor them as well.
Thanks for your talk. I don't know that we have time really to go in very deep to the 1,000 things that have been teeming in my mind as you were speaking.
Come to lunch.
Yeah. I would suggest, and I'm sure you're already aware of this, that the story that you tell here today is analogous to the autoethnography that you were citing, because you had a particular experience and you're narrating your particular experience, and you can to some extent generalize from it, but I haven't read the Wonder Woman article, and maybe she has some legitimate grounds on generalizing from her experience as well. But setting all that aside, I think your main complaint as you began to get into the substance of your talk was that these departments that are generating, and again, I don't know to what extent in the more rigorously juried journals, whether it's as bad as what you're describing or not, that these departments came into existence in order to implement a political agenda. I just want everybody to kind of take a step back and remember that there was a time not so long ago when the academy, you drew an analogy to owning the whole street, the academy was owned by white males. It was not very long ago, okay? And they were putting forth an agenda too, which had to do with a particular Western culture and the capitalist machine that's being built. That was what the academy was. And you may call it postmodernism or something for somebody to come in and say, well, to what extent is everybody's thinking structured and affected by the environment that they find themselves in? I think the acceptance of peonage and the feudal system, everybody understood that that's the world they lived in 500 years ago. People don't think that way anymore because a lot of the popular conversation has changed, okay? It's hard to put cause and effect on that.
Sure.
So these departments are putting forward a new narrative that people can use to challenge the assumptions that they've been reared with.
Sure.
And think in new ways. And a lot of it is going to be speculative at the beginning parts. And you're going to get, your so-called data at some point down the road. But, we have a transition that we're trying to move through here.
Sure.
And nobody knows where it leads.
Right.
But, to suggest maybe, and I don't know that you certainly didn't use these words, that somebody's not well-meaning in what they're trying to do here.
No, I think they are.
Okay. Well, and, I could just ramble all day.
No. That's an excellent point. And I do like that you said that this is sort of an autoethnography. So it is, in a way. It's similar. A hoax is certainly not scholarship. So it's been a little bit interesting. I got invited to a conference I can't attend to be on a panel about academic hoaxes and their impacts. I'm like, I'm not an expert in academic hoaxes. I just did one. I don't know about their broader impact and all this. So, this is an event that drew a lot of attention, and as the previous question, pointed out, I think that the proof will end up being in the pudding in terms of whether or not this ended up being something more to be judged, retroactively as being more flippant or being more poignant, and we'll see what happens within the fields. Now, as far as postmodernism goes, this is a little bit worse, but let me back up before I say that. As far as the political agenda goes, I agree with you that during the radical period in which it began in the 1960s, the idea to remake the academy not to be the white male boys club was necessary. Not just a good idea, a great idea, a necessary idea. That hegemony, to use the word that the gender scholars love to use a lot, it was really a problem. And greater equality is exactly what we should be talking about. But we have this situation, a couple of points about it. One where there's this subtle, spurious use of language where inclusivity means something different than what it sounds like, and the mystery is allowed to be perpetuated until the goal is achieved. That being one issue. Another issue is, take for example, I mentioned the paper Doing Gender by West and Zimmerman, which asserts that gender is something we perform. We aren't male and female, we perform our gender, male or female, or whatever other position it happens to be. And it's not just that there is an aspect to it that is performance, so that, the idea of a man, a male biologically person trying to, take on very feminine roles or whatever, that certainly that there's nothing wrong with that if that's what the person wants to do. Let them be happy, fine. But the argument actually precedes that it's entirely that. It's entirely a performance. And this has been refuted. This has been refuted quite thoroughly. The best research, which I'm not a really well-informed expert on, but the best research that I've seen about the role of culture and biology on gender is some of both. Some of it is social construction. Some of it is the way we think about our station in life. And some of it, and to that degree, there should be work challenging that and looking at new ways, keeping what works in the moment and moving away from what doesn't, and dealing with that as it changes through time. But then there's a part that's also quite uncontroversially not just a social construction. And to assume that you can engage in activism that tries to beat nature, to what degree it is important, out of somebody becomes really troublesome. Now, I come from the Southeast, good Christian country. Put on my accent for that. And I grew up knowing a guy who, I don't know if you know that the Bible mentions the sin of being left-handed many times. It's of the devil. And so he was born left-handed, and his mama tied his left arm to his body until he was like 6 years old, so that he would learn to use his right hand dominant instead, so that he wouldn't be satanic. This really happened. It turns out that people have studied this because it has happened a number of times to people. It, I think, was fairly common at one point in really kind of regressive Christian circles to take the left-handed satanicness out of people. And what it turns out they show is that if somebody's born left-handed, whatever set of influences lead to that, and you tie their left hand to their body and force them to use their right hand, They will get competent with their right hand. They will always retain some competence with their left hand, so they'll be ambidextrous to some degree. But they will never get as good with either hand as they would have gotten with their left hand had they were able to pursue. So if there is a portion of gender that is biologically based, whether it's 25%, 50%, 75%, and then you proceed along an ideology that says that you can stamp that part out, that you can tie the male gender down and make it act more feminine, for example, and that the outcomes will be better. What in reality is likely to be happening is that you're going to stunt the growth of, in this case, boys as they grow up. And if that's the case, responsible scholarship regarding to gender and responsible work, activism done to challenge prevailing social forces has to take that legitimately into account rather than, as Charlotta Stern showed, intentionally ignoring it, attacking the science that supports it, writing papers saying that when science says things like that there is a biological component to gender, it's being sexist and therefore needs to be taken out of the academy and replaced with feminist standpoint science or feminist standpoint epistemologies that get feminist answers to questions rather than answers to questions. And so that's where my real concern lies, is if people want to engage in niche scholarship, if they want to engage in political activism, if they want to engage in scholarship to support their activism, that's fine. But if they want to do this and they're not willing to adhere to the best information that we have coming from science and the best arguments we have coming from philosophy at the same time, then they need to get the hell out of the university and go do it on their own time.
Okay, I'm a affirmative action woman who actually began my career because the company I was working with brought in for summer interns basketball players who actually made double what we'd been working in the same department, and we were working nights to cover what they did. So I'm very aware of white male supremacy. And because the company I worked for did that, affirmative action took over, and all of a sudden, 7 of us women were sent out to the sales force, which was at that point 700 men. And the problem I have with gender studies is I don't like them either, because they don't get to what you can do to make people accept people in areas that are not sexual. In movies, you want a boy and a girl and they're anatomically different. In strength, yes, maybe most women are not as strong as men, but how many jobs do we have that need strength? So one thing that really stuck with me is training used to be, and maybe some people have had it, was a Myers-Briggs, and they'd show you that you were a driver and this was an amiable, and I forgot what the other 4 were. Mm-hmm. But the whole point of that grid, and we're talking the 1960s, and they swore they had evidence for it, and I think they must because it's still taught, was that you can have all these different personality types in the office, and you need them all, and they go into the elaborate why you need them all. And that, I just feel like all the academics, gender studies, black studies, are all a form of, since you can say penis, I can say mental masturbation.
Oh, yeah. Because
they don't get to the study of, okay, we've got a business problem, we've got an environment problem, we found this science and we don't know what to do with it, so we need to put down some, ethics for it, whatever. It doesn't get ever to the point of, you may have one idea, I may have one idea, and they both just might work. And so you're picking on gender studies, which is a little sensitive since I'm one of the genders they're studying, and blacks are one of the genders, and I was there. But we haven't come anywhere from stopping 13 white men in a room figuring out my health care. And over and over again. And the problem is, they can demonstrate success. We were white men, we made money for this company, so our way of doing it made success. And yet you showed Uber. We're showing company after company failing because they can't think of another way. They can only think of a white male way. So I'm just saying that maybe the standard for departments should be, okay, you found that out, now what the hell do we do with it to live together in peace?
Well, for cultural commentary, that may very well be accurate. I will add, not to play this, but this is, where you said that, and I'm not picking on you at all, where you said that you're one of the genders being studied. So when you bring up identity issues, one of the problems that's been documented through moral sociology is what's called competitive victimhood. So you bring up your identity, it triggers in me a desire to talk about my identity, and this is inherently divisive, so it doesn't help people live together. So my first thought, and I'll share it now that I've excoriated myself for saying so, was, well, actually your gender isn't the only one that they're talking about. My gender, according to Annie Potts in 2001, is based upon an irrational penis self that reduces me to a primal carnal intelligence that operates in contrast to and thereby resists the man's rational cerebral thought. So in other words, because I'm a man, I can't help but think with my unit. And this is exactly the kind of, that's what the conceptual penis is that societally we all think with our units, therefore climate change. And these kinds of ideas, again, if you want to save the world in this way or try to, by all means. But it doesn't constitute rigorous scholarship and doesn't belong in a university. Make up your own, your own think tank, just like the conservatives do.
Okay, let's give Jim a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you.